but didn't know anything, and yet there was pastors that would work with me, and I have enjoyed getting to know Ethan better over the past few weeks. I've known his family for years. I've actually known him since he was a very young man, but knew him from a distance, really. My family has known his family for quite some time, and so when the Lord opened up this door and we had prayed about it, I felt like it'd be a good opportunity for our church. And he has shared with me how he's enjoyed our church family. You've been very kind to him in just reaching out, and some of you have spent time with sharing a meal with him and just talking to him. But a few things I wanted to share with you that I've seen in Ethan's life that have been encouragement to me. Found out right away, Ethan enjoys having fun. And it's always fun to be around somebody who enjoys having fun. And so he does enjoy that. Our kids have enjoyed him. Our teens have enjoyed him. I've enjoyed spending time with him. He's not afraid to work, and he's jumped in with projects around the house and around the church, and just jumped right in and has been involved. He's been working another part-time job at Menards, and see him leave early sometimes in the morning, and has been faithful to do that. On one of the when he went to the teens with the teen retreat, was there all of that weekend, and came back late Saturday and was heading right to Menards to work a few more hours that night. So he's been busy, and that was a weekend we didn't get much sleep. So he was working hard. But I've noticed he's also been very willing to do whatever he's been asked to do, and he's been very teachable. And that'll take you a long way in ministry. Just willingness and being teachable, and I have appreciated him being here. He'll really be here for a couple more weeks. This week he'll be here doing some things still with the teens. You've heard about those. And then next week, our plan is Ethan and I are going to go up to the Victory Conference up in Wisconsin. And I felt like it'd be a great thing for him to experience up there. And so we're going to be going up to that. And then Ethan will actually head back to Iowa on his birthday, which is a week from Saturday. It'll be his birthday. So he'll be going back to Iowa on his birthday. And I know his fiance is glad to get him back on his birthday. And so he'll be there. And then the 26th of March, Ethan's going to be getting married up in Iowa. And so I hope you'll be praying for him. Big changes, big decisions, and we're excited for him. So I've asked him tonight. He's spoken to our teens. He has spoken to the young people in Children's Church. And so tonight I've asked if he'd speak to us as a church family. So Ethan, you come and you preach what God's laid on your heart. We've enjoyed having you here.
Fun. Oh, let's make sure how this one works before I came up here, but you know. Oh, that's pretty easy. Never mind. It's not as hard as other ones. The first time I actually met Pastor and his family, I think I was 7. Let's see, it was 2006. So yes, I was 7. We were at SeaWorld with his parents. And then they were in the area, so they came to SeaWorld too. And Zach was he was younger than the twins, and he was the only child. So that was a long time. I feel really old thinking about that. I'm only 22, and that makes me feel old. So let's open up in a word of prayer real quick. Dear Lord, I do thank you for this day. Thank you for this opportunity, Lord. It's not something that I deserve. I just pray that I would ask that you would simply speak through me, that it not be the words that I speak, but it would be words that you would speak through me. Pray you'd bless tonight, Lord. May it be a challenge, Lord. It's been a challenge to me, and I ask that it would continue to be a challenge to me of being a godly leader, Lord, in your name. Amen. So if any of you, I know some of you got to know me a little bit, you can turn in your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 11. That's where we'll be tonight. But if any of you have got to know me, you know I like World War II. So I am fascinated with World War II history. So often some of my opening illustrations have to do with World War II, which tonight is no different. In World War II, the German supercruiser Scharnhorst had a legendary career as a surface raider and warship for the German Navy in World War II. It helped in sinking many Allied ships, including a capital carrier of Britain, and multiple successful merchant raids into the Atlantic, and also made the Channel dash to home ports in Germany when it should have been destroyed by the Royal Navy. But she would not last the war, and she would meet her fate at the end of 1943. In that year, the Scharnhorst was deployed to Norway to intercept Allied convoys going to Russia under the Lend-Lease program through the Arctic Circle. It was a very cold mission. I would not envy that. It's like when the ships would go through the wakes, the water would go up on the ship, and it would instantly freeze because it was that cold. I'm like, that's too cold. On one such occasion, at the end of, actually December 25th, the Scharnhorst and 10 German destroyers deployed to intercept a convoy bound towards Russia, but the British were waiting to set a trap for her. The convoy was escorted by British destroyers and a couple of British cruisers, which, on their lucky first salvo, took out the forward radar on the Scharnhorst, leaving her blind in the forward position. Soon she turned away because she knew the cruisers, but she ended up running straight towards the British battleship Duke of York. The Scharnhorst had been designed to either outfire any cruiser that she couldn't outrun or outrun any battleship that she couldn't outshoot. But she didn't know that the Duke of York was coming up on her side. All of a sudden, the Duke of York appeared and started firing, and after a while, they managed to get a lucky shot on the engines of the Scharnhorst, crippling her to half speed. Eventually, the destroyers and cruisers caught up, releasing many torpedoes, and finally, the German warship sank beneath the waves. British Admiral Bruce Fraser said, "Gentlemen, the battle against the Scharnhorst has ended in victory for us. I hope that any of you who are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against an opponent many times superior will command your ship as gallantly as the Scharnhorst was commanded today." The crew of the Scharnhorst went to their fate, doing their duty, not knowing it would be the end of their ship and many of their lives. Only 36 men of over 1,000 would survive. So too did a man in the Bible do his duty to the last battle, not knowing it would be his last. And we will be turning to 2 Samuel chapter 11, and that man is actually Uriah. So we'll start off in verses 1 and 2 of 2 Samuel chapter 11. In chapter 11 it says, "And it came to pass, after the year was expired, that the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon, and besieged Rabath, but David tarried still at Jerusalem." So, first a little bit of context, because it says, "and it came to pass," so obviously something had to come to pass of why Joab was going out to battle, and David stayed at home. The people of Ammon, in chapter 10, their king had died. His son had taken over in his place, and David had sent servants to encourage him and tell him, to be friendly and to open a friendly relationship, but the king of Ammon's advisors told him that they were coming to spy the land. So he mistreated his servants, he shaved them and sent them away, severely mistreated. And he offended David and the kingdom of Israel. But instead of humbling themselves and apologizing for offending Israel and King David, they doubled down by hiring the Syrian army to come fight for them and to fight with them against Israel. Joab and the army went out to fight them. Joab took the best of the men. They ended up in I can't remember what valley they were in, but they were in this position, and the Syrians had actually managed to come up in front of them, and the Ammonites came up behind them. So they're essentially attacked on two sides, that either way they go, they're going to run into enemy forces. So they're outnumbered and cut off, and Joab takes the best of the children of Israel to fight the Syrians, which evidently were the better of the soldiers, I guess. Mercenaries, something like the Hessians maybe in the Revolutionary War, if you know that. And Abishai, his brother, fought against the Ammonites. And they said that they would do their best and they'd leave the victory to God. And just in more modern history, in the Six-Day War, Israel defeated a larger, more powerful enemy with the Lord's blessing and provision. Then Joab had David cross over the Jordan and destroyed another huge army of the Syrians, and whom then paid tribute to the kingdom of Israel. The Syrians no longer had an alliance with the Ammonites, and they withdrew from the war. But evidently, this was near the later time in the year, towards perhaps the fall or winter, where the weather conditions are not favorable for war. Rain causes mud, which is not really happy for war. So they will usually rest in the winter till wait for spring to come, where there'll be good weather again, solid roads, and plenty of supplies from the previous harvest. So, in the springtime, when the ground now becomes usable for war operations, David sent Joab to besiege the capital of Ammon without himself. when normally at that time kings led at the front during the time of the year, which was good for war. From this text, David did not go out to war as often as he would have or should have. They don't really know exactly why. Some people think that maybe he was getting older, but we see later in the same book, in just a chapter over, that he still goes out to attack the Amorites. So we don't really know why David decided this time to stay at Jerusalem when all the other times he had gone out to fight the enemies of Israel. But because David did not do as probably was customary and he should have, he opened himself up to a failure because of his lack of faithfulness and diligence. Instead, he may have been idle and complacent, not only in his war, but in his duties, but also with his relationship with God. It does not say that he inquired of the Lord, nor that the Lord told him to send the army to Ammon. Oftentimes, even just before this recently, David, when he became king, asked the Lord about fighting the Philistines twice on two separate occasions. And then once God said go up against them, and the other time God said to essentially hide in the bushes and flank them. It does not say that David inquired of the Lord, nor that the Lord told him to attack the Ammonites. So it is possible that he did this of his own flourishing and not of what God had told him to do. For the first point, would be the reluctance of David, if you want to keep notes, the reluctance of David to do his duties, Is it not our time of great danger to failure when we are not diligent and we become complacent? Oftentimes when we fail or we get into danger personally, it's because we are not staying diligent and faithful to what God has told us to do or some of our everyday duties. We become less faithful in our duties at home, perhaps, or we become less diligent at work. We may serve less at church. David's son said that whatever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might, which was Solomon. We must be doing our best in our work and our life. Idleness is said to be the devil's playground. There's a great danger when we are not at the place that we are supposed to be. Also, something else, I'm going to steal an idea, a biblical idea that someone else had told me recently. There's a difference between being in isolation and being in solitude. Isolation is different. God has called disciples, to come apart for solitude. There's a difference. Isolation is being in your own thoughts, being isolated from other people. But solitude is a time spent with God and reflection and learning and improving yourself. But isolation is a time of self-talking, of misunderstanding the situation, of worrying about yourself and not really spending time with the Lord. A good example, what started out as fear-driven isolation, was with Elijah when he was afraid of Jezebel saying he was going to kill him. He just ran out of fear and isolated himself from people. He didn't go to get alone with God. He got a way to isolate from other people, which it ended up being a time of solitude with God in the bush and hearing the still small voice of the Lord. But it didn't start out as solitude. It started out as isolation. I believe that's the difference. If we isolate, we are involved in our own thoughts and desires. But when we come apart to a time of solitude, we are thinking on God and we come apart to find a time of solitude with God, dwelling on the things which are above, like Colossians chapter 3 talks about, and thinking then can be greatly beneficial instead of harmful. We must come apart for a purpose and a reason, and we must have a barrier or line of protection set up when we do this so that we don't slip into isolation or failure. I think a big part of why David failed is because I do think this is a big part of why David failed is because he was spending time with himself and he wasn't being faithful in what his duties were supposed to be. He may have been idle or complacent. He could have been isolating himself, which caused a dramatic and devastating consequences. And each and every one of us could do the exact same thing as David did. We just think we wouldn't sometimes. We never think that we would have an affair with somebody or cheat at our job or steal from somebody. But we all can do those things if we really think about it. We're all capable of those things, but the reason we have the ability not to do those things is the Holy Spirit that lives within us. Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 7, where he's going on about, he does the things that he doesn't want to do and the things that he wants to do that he doesn't, because he's living a life, essentially that's the life of the flesh. And he's almost afraid of that. But then he comes to chapter 8, which is one of the most amazing chapters in all of the Bible, that we don't have a spirit of fear, but we have a spirit of love and of a sound mind. He also says that those who walk in the Spirit do not fulfill the lust of the flesh. Walking in the Spirit is the ability to go through our lives without having that regret of failures and of sin. It is the ability to not walk in the flesh. And that is what I think, unfortunately, David didn't do. And honestly, oftentimes we can do. I can do. That's my dangerous time, is when I have extra leisure time without scheduling things that I need to do or could do. That's my time of danger, of doing things that are harmful and not helpful within my spiritual walk or my relationships with other people, is when I don't have something to do, I don't have a plan. Oftentimes when we don't have a plan, that is when we fail. So unfortunately, we'll continue reading now in verse 2. And it came to pass in eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? I do wonder at times, in modern military times, with your best men like the king or the president has military balls that you have times with. And I wonder if that had taken place in Israel, where they would have had a military ball, and that David had already met Bathsheba and he had already had some sort of interest, but he was walking with the Lord, and obviously didn't, but this time he wasn't walking with the Lord. Now let's look at the resolve of Uriah. The resolve of Uriah. In we just read verse number 3. We'll start at verse 4. And David sent messengers and took her, and she came unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. And the woman conceived, and sent and told David, and said, I am with child. And David sent to Joab, saying, Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. And Uriah was come unto him. David demanded of him how Joab did, and how the people did, and how the war prospered. And David said to Uriah, Go down to thy house, and wash thy feet. And Uriah departed out of the king's house, and there followed him a mess of meat from the king. And Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and went not down to his house. And when they had told David, saying, Uriah went not down unto his house, David said unto Uriah, Comest thou not from thy journey? Why then didst thou not go down unto thy house? And Uriah said unto David, The ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go unto mine house to eat and drink, and to lie with my wife? As thou livest, and as thy soul liveth, I will not do this thing. And David said to Uriah, Tarry here today also, and tomorrow I will let thee depart. So Uriah abode in Jerusalem that day and then the morrow. And when David had called him, he did eat and drink before him, and made him drunk. And at evening he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his lord, but went not down to his house. So, who was exactly Uriah? The Bible tells us earlier in 1 and 2 Samuel and in 1 Kings, I believe, or the book of the Chronicles, that Uriah was one of David's mighty men. He was one of David's 30 mighty men. There's actually, at times there's like 36, but overall that's through some of them died or something, or some were transferred out, but usually there was always 30 men. What I could find suggests that these 30 would have been akin to the U.S. Navy's SEALs or Army Rangers. It was David's and Israel's special forces operators. I could not find anything, though, that would suggest Uriah held any type of army command role, like a captain or a major or a close rank, but it may have been possible. But we do know he was a mighty man, a man who would have been essentially a Navy SEAL or an Army Ranger. They were Israel's special forces. These were the men that were the best warriors, the best soldiers in the army. They had been with David since he hid from Saul in the caves, and before he even became king, or it even looked possible to become king, they had been fighting with David for a very, very long time, for years. And it also makes sense, as we will read later, why they would have put Uriah and the others at the hardest point of the battle, because honestly, that would have been normal for them. If they're the best soldiers, they would have led the men in the hardest points of the battle. Uriah was a man dedicated to his men and to his mission. David called him home from the front lines. Ultimately, yes, he asked him, how was the war going? How is Joab doing? How's the army? But really, he wanted him to get him home so that he could spend the night at home, so it would look like it was Uriah's baby and not David's baby, so it could cover up David's sin. But he was more dedicated to his brothers in arms, his band of brothers, than he was to spending the time even with his own wife. He reasoned that they couldn't go home. The battle was not over, so therefore he could not leave them behind and go home when they were not at home. He would not spend the night with his wife when they could not spend the nights with their wife. So that was the first night, and David finds out that, Uriah didn't go spend the night with his wife. So David got him drunk to try and get him to go home, and he still slept in the servants' area and didn't go to his wife. At this time, I've heard it said that a drunk Uriah was more honorable than a sober David, unfortunately. Uriah is just almost one of my favorite Bible characters in the Bible because of his faithfulness to his duty and his mission and to God. Men, will we be a man like the man Uriah was? He did not shrink from his duties. He did not cower, nor did he leave them when given the opportunity. He remained faithful through difficulties and apparent ease. He showed the very godly character and dedication to God and others, and faithfulness to God and others, and the mission at hand that had drawn Uriah to David in the first place. All the attributes that Uriah showed in his interaction with David at this point was the very reason that Uriah had been drawn to David in the first place, because David had shown those attributes to him. One of a faithful character, of hard work, of a godly soldier and a godly man. That's why Uriah had followed David, is because he saw that in him and wanted to be like David. David was the man who's had these attributes in the beginning. But unfortunately, David did not possess these attributes at this time. So the question is, what are we going to do? Especially as men. I know it's maybe a little bit more pointed to men, but Uriah was a special forces soldier. He could have been a captain. He was a leader no matter what. He had a family, and he was a soldier in the army. He was a leader, and he showed great godly character and resolve to complete the mission and duty above his own personal ease, above spending time with his wife. Will we do the same? Will we put our duty to others, to our wives, to our children, to work, to our service at church, above our own ease and above our own comforts? Will we remain faithful when trials come and difficulties? Uriah faced, I'm sure that he faced many great difficulties, even some of people looking down on him because he was a Hittite. He wasn't actually a true Israelite. Some people would have looked down on him differently, that he really shouldn't get to be in the Israeli army. So I'm sure some soldiers thought that way, that he shouldn't get to be in the Israeli army, let alone in the special forces. He's a Gentile, a heathen. Yet he remained faithful to God, and God blessed him for it. General Stonewall Jackson said, "Duty is ours and consequences are God's." He was a man that left the consequences to God's. He would run around the battlefield and people would be concerned that he would get hit. And he's like, I will be okay as long as God has a plan for me on this earth. I will not get wounded in this war. And that was true until God did call him home. The motto of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division is no mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great. Duty first. Are we willing to put the mission of the eternal mission that we have above our own, to witness to other people, to have a faithful relationship with God? Is any sacrifice for that relationship with God too great? And are we going to put our duty first above our own? Sadly, secondly, Uriah was left behind. In verse 14, we pick up, and it came to pass in the morning that David read a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. He wrote a letter, and he wrote in the letter, saying, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die." And it came to pass, when Joab observed the city, that he assigned Uriah unto a place where he knew the valiant men were. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab, and there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war, and charged the messenger, saying, "When thou hast made an end of telling the matters of the war unto the king, and if it be so that the king's wrath arise, and he say unto thee, Wherefore approach ye so nigh unto the city, when ye did fight? Know ye not that they would shoot from the wall? Who smote Abimelech, the son of Jerushashebeth? Did not a woman cast a piece of a millstone upon him from the wall, that he died in Thebes? Why went ye nigh the wall? Then sayest thou, Thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So the messenger went and came and showed David all that Joab had sent for him. And the messenger said unto David, Surely the men prevailed against us, and came unto us into the field, and we were upon them even unto the entering of the gate. And the shooters shot from off the wall upon the servants, thy servants, and some of the king's servants be dead, and thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Then David said unto the messenger, Thus shalt thou say unto Joab, Let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as well as another. Make thy battle more strong against the city, and overthrow it, and encourage thou him. And when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah her husband was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife, and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. So Uriah was left behind. Because David could not get Uriah to go to Bathsheba and make it look like it was Uriah's child, he sent a letter to Joab by the hand of Uriah to put him at the front, the hardest part of the front, and let him be killed and left behind. Joab did as he was commanded. He put Uriah at the hottest point of the battle, and there Uriah died. Also, for Uriah to die also, Israel had to lose this battle and other men killed just so Uriah could die. David was willing to lose a phase of the battle and have other men killed and Uriah killed just to cover up his sin. These men are also experienced combat veterans. They know it was unwise to be that close to the city wall, but they still followed orders. They remained faithful even when they knew it was foolish. Joab sends word to David about this phase in the battle and tells him about Uriah. David sends back word to Joab not to be displeased. Now, why would he say, to be displeased? Obviously, he might be displeased because he lost a battle. But I think it was a lot more than that, because I think Joab was probably upset. Not only was Uriah one of his best soldiers, but because of how long they fought together. You see, Uriah was one of the mighty men. He was probably with David since the time of Saul, running from Saul. Uriah was very possibly a very close friend to Joab. And he may have been David's close friend as well. See, David covering up his sin, it wasn't just killing someone he didn't know, it was probably killing a friend. It was probably killing one of Joab's friends and one of his best soldiers. David's son cost Uriah and the other men their lives. Husbands, hasn't our sin, or I shouldn't say our sin, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm close enough that and my sin has cost something. Hasn't our sin cost your wife something before? Maybe it wasn't death, but it caused her pain in her life. And wives, hasn't your sin at times cost your husband something? You see, we have all done and sadly will do things again that hurt other people, that our sin costs other people something, whether our children or our spouses or our church. But we need to seek forgiveness from God and others and be willing and faithful to forgive those who have wronged us. Another side thing also, David's men are not ignorant. The other mighty men have fought with and under David for a long time. They know, like I already said, what an unwise battle tactic is. And they also saw that after Uriah died, David married Bathsheba. After Uriah died in a foolish attack on the city. They very easily could have put two and two together. We don't know that for sure. It's not stated in the Bible, but these are very wise, competent soldiers. And they could have figured out what David had done. At least they know that he made a foolish decision, or that Joab would make a foolish decision, but they know Joab isn't used to making such foolish tactical decisions. But they did not rebel against David and try to take him out. They remained faithful to their duty despite the failure of their leader. And sometimes, and now oftentimes, our leaders Lord willing, won't make a mistake like that, and if they do, we should confront them. But sometimes we are to do the same. If we see a leader or authority do something wrong, we should confront them and challenge them on that. In the right spirit and manner, we must be careful and make sure that you're walking in the Spirit when you confront a leader at times, because sometimes it is the right thing to do. It's kind of scary. I've unfortunately had to do it sometimes, and it's kind of weird, especially when they ignore you. You're like, okay, or, they kind of get after you that you're doing something wrong when you're trying to confront them in the right spirit, but that's not so fun. But anywho, that's a story for another day. Sometimes, though, maybe it's not the big thing we see, but it's something like a besetting fault that they have, or just something that you don't agree with, or you don't like that they've done or chosen to do. Maybe it's not necessarily something that's wrong, but just not how you think is the best way to do something. And you know what? That's okay, and we should talk to our leaders when that happens. That's what the Bible tells us in Matthew 18, is when you have a fault or something you're concerned about, talk to those people that concerns you, or talk to your leader about it. But what we should not do, which Solomon told us was an abomination before the Lord, is to go tell everyone about the situation and get them stirred up against the leader. That is called sowing of discord and trying to pit people against one another. That is pure evil. I've heard evil is sin designed to hurt people, and that is from the devil. The devil wants to bring discord and division, and we should not talk badly about other people, about leaders. Now again, sometimes our leaders are going to make a mistake. They're going to fail, and we should confront them on that. But we're not supposed to go around and tell everyone about it and stir up people to be against the leader. And David's men didn't do that. They had the opportunity. They had the strength. They could have taken David out and made one themselves king, but they didn't do that. They remained faithful to David in spite of his failures. Lastly, this evening, we'll look at the restoration of David. The restoration of David. God sent Nathan to confront David. We'll look in chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. And the Lord sent Nathan unto David, and he came unto him, and said unto him, There were 2 men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing, save one little ewe lamb, which he had brought and nursed up, and it grew up together with him and with his children, and it did eat of his own meat, and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and it was unto him as a daughter. Then there came a traveler unto the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock and of his own herd, to dress for the wayfaring man that was come unto him, but took the poor man's lamb, and dressed it for the man that was come unto him. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. So, the little story that that Nathan had told David, David said that man should be put to death, that was evil, and it was evil. That was something that was worth putting to death. Verse 7, And Nathan said to David, Thou art the man. Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I anointed thee king over Israel, and I delivered thee out of the hand of Saul, and I gave thee thy master's house and thy master's wives into thy bosom, and gave thee the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would moreover have given them unto thee and such things. Wherefore hast thou displeased the commandment of the Lord, to do evil in his sight? Thou hast killed Uriah the Hittite with a sword, and hast taken his wife to be thy wife, and hast slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. Thus said the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this son. For thou didst secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, and before the sun. And David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, The Lord also hath put away this sin thou shalt not die. Howbeit, because of this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. The child also that is born unto thee shall surely die. And Nathan departed out of the house, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore unto David, and it was very sick. Nathan said, Thou art the man, that David was the one that should be put to death, and rightfully so. In the Levitical law, David had done two things that was deserving of death. Committing adultery and murder were both punishable by death under the Levitical law. David should have been put to death. But as our great and merciful God is, he told him that he had forgiven him. God tells David all that he did for David to get him to that point, that he had protected him from Saul, given him Saul's kingdom, his wives, his house, and yet God also gave him his punishment at this time. He said the sword would not depart from his family, which was sadly true. And what he did to Uriah would happen to him in much the same way, which was true with Ammon, Tamar, and Absalom. It would all become full circle with the three of his children, the fulfillment of that prophecy. But again, David repented on the spot when he was confronted with his sin. And it says that God forgave him immediately. We do not have to earn God's forgiveness. All we must do is confess and ask, and he gives. We don't have to spend time doing this right thing or trying to earn that forgiveness, because even though that God was angry at David for his sin, he still loved David and he wanted to forgive him. Obviously, it says that David repented, and immediately God says that he... And Nathan said unto David, The Lord also put away thy sin, thou shalt not die. Instantaneously, God said, I'm not going to kill you, when he had every right to. The law that he had given Israel, David should have died, but God said, I forgive you, and you will not die. That is the exact same way that God treats us. Amen. When we have done wrong, when we have failed, no matter small or big, whether huge or tiny, when we seek God's forgiveness, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all our unrighteousness. We do have to ask for that forgiveness. It is not just given without our confession. We must confess that we have sinned, but God is faithful. But there still had to be a price. His son still had to die. David, for many days, beseeched the Lord that he might spare him, because he knew God was merciful. And God is merciful and gracious. But this time, the child still would not survive. My teacher at school, or who's now a pastor again, said the reason David was a man after God's own heart was he was good at confessing. Many times David failed. He failed here with Bathsheba. He would fail in a couple chapters later with numbering the people for probably pride's sake. But yet what distinguished David from Saul is that he confessed his sin when he was confronted with it. When Saul was confronted with his sin, he blamed the people, he did not take responsibility, and he only repented when he found out the consequences. He was sorry for the consequences that were to befall him. David confessed and was sorry because it hurt God and it made God displeased. David's value was in his relationship to God. Saul's value was in his leadership over Israel. That's why David was a man after God's own heart, is because when he was confronted with his sin, he confessed it and was distraught by it. There should be a more powerful word, but I can't think of it. When he did wrong, he confessed it right away when he was confronted with it. He did not try and hide it or excuse it as Saul had done. David confessing was the reason his relationship with God was so good. It was why Uriah and the other men had followed him in the first place. The reason Uriah had followed David and the other mighty men, why Joab, why Abishai followed David, is because truly he had a deep relationship with God that affected everyone around him. The price of sin still had to be paid, but God forgave, and their relationship was restored to what it was. Sin, though, still comes with a price. It still brings forth death. But like we've said, God does forgive. Then David, we'll pick up in verse 16. I know we've already gone over this, but we'll just try and be quick. David therefore besought God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night upon the earth. And the elders of his house arose and went to him to raise him up from the earth, but he would not, neither did he eat bread with them. And it came to pass on the 7th day that the child died. And the servants of David feared to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, Behold, while the child was yet alive, we spoke unto him, and he would not hearken unto our voice. How will then vex himself if we tell him that the child is dead? But when David saw that his servants whispered, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said unto his servants, Is the child dead? And they said, He is dead. Then David arose from the earth and washed himself and anointed himself and changed his apparel and came into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he came to his own house, and when he required, they set bread before him, and he did eat. And then his servants said unto him, What is this thing that thou hast done? Thou didst fast and weep for thy child, while it was yet alive. But when the child was dead, thou didst rise and eat bread? And he said, While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, Who can tell whether God will be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead, wherefore should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. And David comforted Bathsheba his wife, and went into her, and lay with her. And she bare a son, and he called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him. And he sent by the hand of Nathan the prophet, and he called his name Jedediah, because of the Lord. So we see that still, again, the price of sin had to be paid on their David and Bathsheba's first son. But after that fact, that David washed himself because he knew that there's nothing more he could do. The child now was with God, and he knew that someday he'd get to see the child again, but the child could not come again to him. And God actually blessed them with a new child who would become the next king, Solomon. And Nathan calling the child Jedediah was actually the sign of Solomon becoming the next king. Through forgiveness, sometimes the dead things come back to life. A restored marriage, a vibrant church, a close relationship with God again. Also, as we'll look shortly, when David confessed his sin, they were able to defeat the people of Ammon utterly. In verse 26, and Joab fought against Rabah of the children of Ammon and took the royal city, so it's their capital. And Joab sent messengers to David and said, I have fought against Rabah and have taken the city of waters. Now therefore gather the rest of the people together and encamp against the city and take it, lest I take the city and it be called after my name. And David gathered all the people together and ran to Rabbah and fought against it and took it. And he took their king's crown from off his head, the weight whereof was a talent of gold with the precious stones. And it was set on David's head. And he brought forth the spoil of the city in great abundance. And he brought forth the people that were therein and put them under saws and under harrows of iron and under axes of iron and made them pass through the brickling, and thus did unto all the cities of the children of Ammon. So David and all the people returned unto Jerusalem. When we have unconfessed and hidden sin in our lives, we are unable to take the ground, or we take ground from the enemy. When we commit sin, when we have unconfessed sin, we actually yield some sort of ground in our lives to the devil. That he has some control or influence more so in our lives. However, when we confess our sin and rely upon God, then we are sure of the victory. While David had the sin in his life, they could not defeat the people of Ammon. But when David confessed his sin, it shows that almost immediately the siege was broken and the people of Ammon were defeated. And there's a spiritual correlation to that in our own lives. When we have unconfessed sin, when we're trying to hide something from God, or we don't want to give up something, even talking about surrender, like Brother Thomas talked about this morning, we will not be able to experience true victory in our lives. But when we confess our sins and get it before God and before other people, we can have true victory over sin and over the devil. Remember, though, no man is born a conqueror. He must first be forged in trials, in healing, accountability, restoration, and a renewed mind that sees what God thinks about him and believes it. David believed God had forgiven him, and he knew it. And in that freedom, he and Israel could conquer the enemy. It's the same thing for us. Even though David had been reluctant, had been complacent in his relationship with God and in his duties, when he confessed that and the sin that that led to, he was able to again conquer the enemies of Israel. When we have unconfessed sin or become complacent, there are places in our lives that fall to the enemy. But when we confess those to the Lord, we regain the ability to conquer those for the Lord. So in conclusion, are we being reluctant like David? Are we neglecting or forgetting our priorities? Do we have hidden sin we're trying to keep hidden from God? Well, ultimately, you can't really keep it hidden from God. He knows about it. But we can hide it from other people. We will never gain victory trying to fight it alone in the dark. Are we acting like Uriah, faithful to our duties, to our calling, to the end, no matter the sacrifice? He was faithful to the end. I hope that it could be said of us that we will be faithful to our end, whatever that would look like. He was faithful to his men and to his God until the end. Are we good at confessing our sin when we see it? Are we humble enough to receive that confrontation of someone else might give us? Are we willing to receive the Nathans in our life that confront our sin? Are we willing to humbly accept that they're right and we're wrong and we need to get right with the Lord? Are we confessing sin when we do see it? Do we ask God to reveal our sins to us so that we might walk and fight the best for Him? Again, in closing, just going back to the introduction, that little word, or that little phrase, "Gentlemen, the battle against the Scharnhorst has ended in victory for us." I hope that any of us who are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against an enemy, an opponent, many times superior, will command your ship as gallantly as the Scharnhorst was commanded today. In our life today that is so turbulent and we are in opposition against the enemy and the world every day, will we command our life gallantly for the Lord, or will we become complacent and become another casualty in this war? Let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I do thank you for this day. Thank you for this privilege. Lord, it was nothing. I don't think I preached anything new. I hope I did not. Nothing too deep or complicated, but something that confronts me of being a faithful leader and a faithful soldier, of not being complacent, of not isolating, but having times of true solitude, of spending time with you, and when I do sin, confessing it faithfully so that I can have victory again in our lives. May we be a people that can be confronted by our sin and confess and again have victory and become more than a conqueror. May we be faithful as Uriah was to the people that you have put in our lives to affect, whether that's our family, our co-workers, our siblings. Lord, may we be faithful to serve them and to lead them in the ways that you have called us to do so, Lord. I ask that you would just bless this message again, Lord, not because of me or because I spoke something that was amazing, but because it was your word, and you say that your word would not